hear those sounds? I'm out here by our pond. I was sort of hoping for the spring peepers, but today is a little cold for that, so. But you probably can hear some of the sounds, the birds, cars. But I like coming down here because the sounds are unique and you never really get used to them, but they are familiar. Sounds that are familiar for a reason. Think of your child's voice. It's familiar. Think of your parents' voice. It's familiar. Why is it familiar? Because you've heard it so many times? Because your brain is wired just to know that that's their voice. Our brains are wired to know the sounds, to recognize the sounds of certain things. And it's all the more profound when you realize that God has given us the ability to recognize sounds around us in the same way that He's given us the ability to recognize His voice. Same principle. If we spend time with Him, if we're around Him, if we love Him like we love our children and recognize their voice, then we should be able to recognize His voice. And Scripture talks about His voice, hearing His voice. In Psalm 95, verses 6 and 7, it reads, "Come, let us bow down and worship. Let us kneel before the Lord, our Maker, for He is our God, and we are the people of His pasture, the flock under His care. Today, if only you would hear His voice." Today, if only you would hear His voice. We should be able to recognize His voice. And once we do begin to recognize His voice, sometimes it gets a little tricky because sometimes we don't want to hear what He has to say. He might be saying stuff to us that really we've rather liked doing things our way. Sometimes He speaks to us and it's a challenge to do what He's asked us to do. Samuel was given a lot of insights that God gave him, and he had a challenge before him. He really didn't want to share with Eli the news that God had said. But God had given it to him for a reason. But when we know He's speaking to us and He's asking us to do something, or He's putting something before us, it would be so unwise not to listen to Him. We all know what it's like if we're parents, or even if we remember from when we were kids. When we heard our parents' voice and we really didn't want to do what they were saying, we'd sometimes ignore it. Or maybe we didn't ignore it, but we basically said no. That strong-willed child who says no. God's got big shoulders, but you know what? He'll keep talking to us and He'll keep prompting us. It really is our job to honor Him, to know His voice, and again, we know His voice if we spend time with Him. And it really is up to us to make the right decision, to act. Just like when we're younger, it usually is the right decision to act on what your parents are asking you to do. Well, with God, it can be a lot of different things. He could be asking us to do something. He could be prompting us to deal with something. He could be telling us something. But when He speaks to us and He wants us to act on something, whether it's for ourselves, our lives, for others, we need to be ready to honor Him, to respond to that. And that's what we really want to look at this week. Are we tuning Him out? Or are we willing to hear him and have the courage to act on it? If that's something that we struggle with, let's ask God to help us to honor him, to have the clarity, to know his voice, and to act on what he's saying. Now more than ever, it's so important to get outside of ourselves and begin to see, why has he put us here? What's he saying to us? What does he want us to do in this time? Let's act on it. Let's hear him, slow down, hear him, and let's honor him with our actions. We just pray as we move towards Sunday that this would be something that we could all pray into, that God, what are you saying? And help me to hear you clearly and not just let it go in one ear and out the other. Not to be that young child that does what they want, but we know your voice. And we know you're our Father, and we know that you would not steer us astray. Help us to hear the word you have for each of us and to act on it. Bless you.